Welcome to the Indian Ocean World podcast.
Hello and welcome to a new episode of the Indian Ocean World podcast. I'm Archishman Chaudhuri, a postdoctoral researcher at the Indian Ocean World Center, McGill University. Today, our guest is Professor Denise Matias, a professor at the Eberswalde University for Sustainable Development. She's a research scientist who specializes in environmental sciences and developmental policies, especially on the issue of wild honeybee hunting in the Philippines. Professor Matias started her academic career as a biologist at the Ateneo de Manila University in 2001, where she earned her bachelor's in biology in 2005. She followed this up with a graduate diploma in environmental sciences at the University of the Philippines, Diliman, and she moved on to finish her master's in environmental sciences and policy from the Central European University in 2012. Professor Denise Matias wrote and researched for her doctorate in agricultural sciences at the Bonn University in Germany from 2013 to 2017. Since then, she has held a number of research positions and postdoctoral positions, particularly at the German Development Institute, at the Universitat Autónoma de Barcelona in Spain, and most recently at the Institute for Social-Ecological Research in Frankfurt, Germany. While she developed a career in academia, Professor Matias also worked with different NGOs on conservation practices of Asian honeybees and issues related to climate change. She's a member of the NGO Non-Timber Forest Products Exchange Program, where she works as an associate with Indigenous communities and their livelihood. She's also a fellow of the IPBES on sustainable use of wild species assessment. Professor Matias has published widely on various themes concerning the hunting of giant honeybees from Asia, especially the Philippines. Without much further ado, Professor Denise Matias, I welcome you to our podcast and thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Arjisman. I'm so happy to be here and to talk to everyone today about my research on giant honeybees.
Thank you, Professor Matias. I was wondering if you would like to start off with a rather general point about what your research is, and can you tell our listeners how did you develop an interest in studying the wild honeybees from Asia? I mean, especially maybe their correlation with the local habitats, and what implications do these honeybees have for the larger environment?
Yes, so actually what happened was in 2012, I was working for a consultancy called TMP Systems, and we were developing financial mechanisms for smallholder agriculture and community forestry. And that time, we were collaborating with the NGO Non-Timber Forest Products Exchange Program, so NTFPEP that you have earlier mentioned, where I'm already an associate now. And then during my visit to one indigenous community hunting wild honeybees, they mentioned that they had some issues with the sustainability of the hunting and gathering. And for them, the honey season, so it's called the honey flow, which happens during summertime in the Philippines, is like a very abundant season in terms of financial returns. So they get a lot of money by selling honey. And then after that, they would say like, oh, it's back to eating just whatever they can find. And when I then started to do my PhD, I had a different topic, but I also got exposed to this idea of transdisciplinary research, wherein the research problem derives from social issues or social problems that communities beforehand have already identified. And I thought there is already a problem identified by the communities themselves. Why don't I start my research from that? Because it's a research need that the community said that they needed help with. So I then decided to totally abandon my first research idea for my PhD and then moved on to develop a research in Asian honeybees. Because I know that, as you asked Archisman earlier, that with the local habitat, I'm thinking mostly of how can this help the indigenous communities for their livelihoods, while at the same time promoting the idea of non-timber forest products, that we develop non-timber forest products so that communities do not cut timber and sell it. And then we can conserve the forest. So this is essentially where I was coming from.
Thank you, Professor Matias. I'm just going to build up on this aspect of studying the honeybees, the Asian honeybees. As I had been reading your research, I was struck by a very specific point which you make, that the Universal Honey Standard Codex, which is called the Codex Alimentarius, and its quality criteria, everything is based on the European honeybees. And this does not recognize the Asian bee species. In this respect, you have pointed out how honey harvesters from Asian countries, especially India, Cambodia, Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Philippines, organize a quadrennial conference called the Madhu Dunia to discuss issues that are pertinent to Asian honeybees. I'm just wondering if you could tell us about the politics around the scientific debates that shape often the discourse around Asian honeybees. I mean, does this lack of recognition of the Asian honeybees stem more from a market-oriented scientific research and ideas of promotion where investors fund and help endorse the European honeybees? And if you could tell us, how does this eventually shape the scientific discourse around Asian honeybees in terms of a sort of maybe a global North versus South debate?
Mhm. Yes, this is a very interesting question, because a lot of researchers, a lot of NGO proponents from the Philippines have pinpointed this issue of the Codex Alimentarius. So every time we have this Madudunya, it always pops up. But as you know, the Madudunya is a quadrennial conference, so it happens every 4 years, and still there is no progress. But as you said, it's highly political. So I also presented at sort of a webinar for the Philippine Embassy in Germany, and then the ambassador was there. And then she pointed out that the Codex Alimentarius cannot be changed just by having civil society people proposing, but it's actually political in a way that governments should be the ones proposing the changes. And with the current standard for honey being based on Apis mellifera, this somewhat puts the other Asian honeys at a disadvantage, because they are measured by the yardstick of the Apis mellifera. And for example, Apis dorsata, it's an open nesting species, meaning it's exposed to the elements, it's exposed to moisture, it's exposed to rain. And so its moisture content would be higher than that one of Apis mellifera, which are actually domesticated in boxes. So their moisture content is not that high. And in this sense, the Asian honeys cannot compete because of this standard. And that's where we see that there's discrimination for the Asian honey in the market, because the standard, they don't reach that standard, which has been set for all honeys, but actually it was based on only one species, which is the Apis mellifera. So still, this is already well known, this is well recognized. However, I'm not really privy to what's going on at the background. So there needs to be, I guess, more lobbying for this, from us scientists, and also those from the NGOs, because we see that there is much potential in terms of forming a niche market. So that means getting more payment, getting more value for honey. If this is the honey from Asian honeybees, for example, if only it's recognized as it is. And so, in your question about the global north versus south scientific debate, I was thinking it's actually probably a chicken and egg question, like they would say, yeah, there's not enough research on Asian honeybees. So we only have a lot of research on Apis mellifera, which is the European honeybee. So this is definitely what we can use as basis for Codex Alimentarius. But on the other hand, since the standard is only for Apis mellifera, then it lags, the other Asian honeybees just lag behind, and we don't know what's happening to them. We don't have an idea. We just know that bees, the Apis mellifera bees, are dying off. But how about there's not enough research on the other honeybees? And this is something of, I guess, a global importance, knowing that there is a huge diversity beyond just Apis mellifera.
Thank you, Professor Matias. I'm going to build up on your last point and probably ask you one more question. You have argued that often the European restrictions on non-recognition of the Asian honeys, this prompts even Asian governments to direct conservation practices, research, and economic priorities as well on the European honeybee species. Could you tell us what kind of repercussions this has on a national scale for the different honeybee species across Asia? I mean, I can think of an immediate example from India, where in the eastern Indian state of West Bengal, the government tries to promote and endorse indigenous communities based around fragile mangrove delta of the Sundarbans, which is near the Bay of Bengal. And the honey procured by indigenous communities is endorsed and marketed by the government as a special product. Are there similar counterparts from the Philippines or Vietnam or the other countries which are part of the Madhu Dunya?
Yes, so actually, just thinking about from the Philippines, there are sadly no such efforts like the one in the Sundarbans. And so what happens now is that for us, of course, we really recognize that the Asian honeys can be, meaning like the honey from Asian honeybees. So we call this actually forest honey or wild honey. So can be organic. So again, we need the chemical testing from laboratory to confirm this. I did one chemical test on the samples that I got during my field work, and the response from my collaborator in Germany was, wow, this is super honey, because it just didn't have any of the chemicals that normally is allowed for honey in Germany to have. So they allow a certain amount of chemical because the Apis mellifera or the European honeybee, they suffer from so-called parasites. And then they use miticides, so to kill mites, varroa mites. So sometimes these miticides also go with the honey. And so there is the allowable amount of chemicals to get into the honey. But for at least for the forest honey, we see that it's just in the forest. I also sort of traced the area where they were foraging and then tried to look at through remote sensing the area where they go. Of course, we don't really follow where they go, right? But we still have an idea that this is within the forest, and it's special in a way. So I argue that these honeys are special. This forest honey is special because Palawan is where I did my research, is the so-called last frontier in the Philippines, so Palawan Biosphere Reserve. And it has a very high biodiversity, and there are also endemic trees. And we see that the honey could be similar to wine. The idea of terroir, or that this grapes can only grow in this type of terrain, etc., and then it has a distinct taste. So we also think that it's possible for honey that it will have a distinct taste that only comes from an area. And this is, from a marketing point of view, something that we would like to use for the forest honey. But this is not being recognized because in the Philippines, it's just honey, whether it's coming from Apis mellifera, whether it's coming from Apis dorsata, the giant honeybee that I worked with. And so it's not given that much attention, sadly, like unlike the one from the Sundarban, that the government is actually promoting it. So until now, no, there is a lack of recognition for their special characteristics.
Thank you, Professor Matias. I'm going to move the discussion a bit more towards Philippines. You make two very significant points. While surveying the areas that produce the Asian honeys in Philippines, you make this point that there is a strong correlation between a low level of formal education and correct identification of the giant honeybees, and the decrease in vegetation cover limits the presence of the wild honeybees or the giant honeybees, which again limits the opportunities for non-honey hunter-gatherer members of the communities to interact with these bees, or to acquire knowledge or experience about wild honey hunting, gathering, and conservation practices. But this acquirement of knowledge or knowledge production on the honeybees, you have argued, it's a continual process that requires renewal through time to time. So I was wondering if you could tell us a bit more about what has changed in the Philippines in the past couple of years, especially in areas of wild honey hunting, conservation practices, and how indigenous communities have responded to this. For instance, you argue that 90% of the respondents who correctly identified the honeybees live in an area of high vegetation cover. But as I understood from your research, these areas of high vegetation cover are often incongruous. I mean, in the sense that they're not located close by or next to each other. So, are there any differences within these different regions? Because honeybees, as you have pointed out, honeybees and societies support each other in a shared ecosystem, or what you call the social-ecological services. I was wondering if you could tell us how changes from climate change or decrease in vegetation cover have affected sustainable honey farming in the Philippines, which, as you have pointed out, is often dominated by economic benefits rather than a clear ecological understanding of the issue at hand.
Yes, sure. So let's go first to the first one that you mentioned about the result that I got about the correlation between low level of formal education and correct identification of the giant honeybees. And for us, this was a surprise because we always thought that the more highly educated one is, the more that they would do correct identification of species, perhaps. But so for us, the proxy here for local knowledge was the giant honeybees. And so I did some statistics on this and saw that it was quite robust. And it was also a surprise, but not really, because there is the push nowadays to get indigenous communities, indigenous children to study formal education. And when they do, they have to leave the forest area, and then they stay sort of not in the city, but it's just a center where of the province. And in this way, they lose the connection to the forest, and they lose connection as well to the day-to-day goings on in their families. And as I've mentioned, I think this also touches upon the Sustainable Development Goal on education, that there needs to be a qualification, or qualifying that indigenous people should be able to have indigenous education. So education that still promotes their culture and tradition. And this is something that's so far not very well institutionalized in the Philippines. And actually, to add, another thing is that indigenous communities back home are very much discriminated against. So it often happens that some indigenous children would rather not identify as indigenous because they get picked on at school. And it's ongoing. It's an ongoing thing from then until now. And I just wish our society would mature better to understand that there's just this diversity of people present in the community. As for the vegetation, so yes, we also see that the honey hunters were saying that the vegetation cover was slowly receding, and so they had to slowly go up further in the forest to look for honeybees. And so then this renewal of knowledge is gone because the non-honey hunter-gatherer members who don't go with the honey hunters deep into the forest, they don't get to experience this, seeing the hunting or just interacting with the honeybees themselves. So this is something that we see changing within the local community, and that now with the sustainable honey hunting, probably more motivated by economic benefits, it's also a little bit changing the practice. So for example, sustainable honey hunting means that you only take the honey part and then you leave the part where there are the baby bees or the brood. But actually they do that probably for sustainability, but actually they do that because the honeycomb or the beehive regenerates after 1 to 2 weeks, and then they find honey again. So then I don't know anymore if it's really a sustainable way, or if it's an economic practice. And so these are the changes. Very dynamic how it's working, but at the end of the day, it's a practice that they've been doing since time immemorial, I guess. Even in history books, this has been chronicled. And we just hope that it continues, because as you mentioned earlier, Achisman, climate change is also affecting the honeybees. So sometimes in the summer it's too dry, so they don't have any nectar to look for, or there would be this sudden rains that are so strong that the blossoms or the flowers just drop to the ground, and they get destroyed, and then the honeybees don't find nectar again because it's just there's no flower. So hopefully, yeah, we'll see. Hopefully that it will still be able to persist given this global changes happening. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Matias. I will stay on with this point on sustainability of honey hunting and development of honey-related products a bit longer. I'll just build up on my previous question, and especially on some of your responses to that question. You have pointed out respondents who, although they appreciated the effectiveness of the regulations that try to ensure sustainability of wild honeys and honey development of honey-related products from wild honeys. Nonetheless, as you pointed out, these respondents also complained that honeybees moved away from the lowlands up to the mountains. This, as I understand, resulted from a decrease in the vegetation cover, which reduced the foraging area for honeybees, forcing them to look for more suitable habitats. A corollary to this, as I presume, is the wild honey hunter-gatherers would also encounter a loss in livelihood. I'm wondering if you could tell us about a bit more about the demographic impact of the movement of honeybees. So what happens to wild honey hunter-gatherers in areas that no longer support the honeybees? Do they switch to other professions, or do they also migrate to areas where the honeybees have moved? And in cases where they do move to areas where the honeybees have migrated, does this cause tensions over use of limited forest resources among different wild honey hunting gathering groups? And how does the government try to address this problem in its policy making?
Yes, so definitely this is an issue, and sadly, the government doesn't really care. So, and I think maybe on the one hand, it's also a positive thing, because if this gets really regulated, then there could be a lot more red tape, a lot more bureaucracy. So I think for now, this at this scale, it's working very well that NGOs are helping the honey hunters. However, yes, it's an issue, because what happens when they don't find the hives easily? They either go very, very far, and then it takes up a lot of their time. So opportunity cost wise, they could have done other things, but then they have to stay in the forest for 1 week or so. So I've experienced going with them. We were looking for honeybees for 3 days or so. And then we only found, if I remember correctly, around 2 or 3 hives. And so within those 3 days, it's the whole day of really looking at these tall trees and wondering, is there a beehive there? And then next, if you see a beehive, you ask, is this already ripe enough to harvest the honey? Otherwise, no, you would have to go back there later, hoping that you find it again. And so it's just this difficult situation. But to look for other jobs, there are actually odd jobs in the off season, or other than that, it's just really a loss of livelihood. And so they just try to get by, for example, with farming or with gathering fruits and selling this, and that's how it goes. As for tensions over this, like it's sort of really a common pool resource. They sort of know whose hive is whose. So when a hive has already been found, they put a mark, like an X mark on the tree, and then they know that someone already found it, and then they wouldn't touch it. But then what they do is to just really go very far away. So they don't suffer as much from other issues, like with the resin collection of a species called Agathis philippinensis. This is where there's a lot of tension, but I didn't really hear of a big tension with honey hunting. It's just really a communal type of gathering that they go together in groups of 5 or in groups of 3 or 4, and then that's how they look for honey during the summer season. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Matias. I'm going to ask you a few final questions. What are your suggestions as a policy researcher or as a development scientist to sustain the wild honeybees, the giant honeybees, and their associated social ecological systems in Asia, especially when we are living under clear signs of a changing climate, which would often prompt a number of climatic anomalies? Especially, I can imagine the lowland forests are at a greater danger from rising sea levels in the Philippines. If you could summarize your points or your thoughts on this. Thank you.
Yes, so it's very important that we recognize that climate change is telecoupled. So meaning that these indigenous communities, they don't really have that much emissions, carbon emissions. They don't contribute that much to climate change, but as we could see, their livelihoods are also affected. Much more the honeybees. They don't really contribute to anthropogenic climate change, but they are very much affected. And tomorrow, as we record this, tomorrow is the global climate strike. And I guess initiatives such as this is very important. And this podcast itself, I think it's very nice that you guys try to highlight these pockets of stories which can be found deep in the forest and probably do not really reach this type of audiences in the Western world. And so for us who are working on these social ecological systems, especially with indigenous communities, we foremost suggest to be engaged in the global issue of climate change. But on a local level, of course, we hope that foremost there would be the necessary policies, especially for governments to listen to NGOs. So for example, with the Codex Alimentarius, and then secondly, what can be done to better recognize the special characteristics of forest honey from Asian honeybees in the market. And of course, the government has a say on that because they are the ones who are setting also the regulations. And thirdly, for civil society, it's just for us researchers, we try our best to reach out and to let them know that they also have a role in this, and just learning to buy honey from proper sources. Of course, there are also issues with counterfeit honey, etc. We would like to support the indigenous communities and hopefully also pay them properly. So that's also an issue wherein we just say that, yeah, they get paid but how much? And often, if there are those initiatives that sell this honey like as special honey, and then they charge so much money for it, but it doesn't go back to the communities. So we also need to have this awareness that it's not just about paying the communities, but also paying them right. And so with that, I just call for solidarity with the indigenous communities who are trying their best to live while conserving the forests and, of course, the giant honeybees. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Matias, for what has been a very informative and rich talk on the Asian honeybees, especially the species in the Philippines and what kind of challenges the species face from climate change and the hunting-gathering communities that are dependent on these ecological systems encounter as well. Thank you also to my colleague, Renee Mandeville. Until our next podcast, I wish you the very best. Stay safe, everyone. You've been listening to the Indian Ocean World podcast.
The Indian Ocean World podcast would like to acknowledge the generous support of the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. This podcast series is part of the SSHRC-funded partnership project Appraising Risk, Past and Present, interrogating historical data to enhance understanding of environmental crises in the Indian Ocean world.